The story of beginnings is told in many voices, and one of them begins like this. Imagine the garden in its first stillness, where the trees had only just stretched their branches into a sky that smelled of rain. The rivers moved in slow silver coils, unbroken by boats or bridges. The animals looked about with the same startled wonder as if they too had just awakened into existence. And in this new world, where every leaf still carried the dew of creation, humankind was shaped. The common tale insists that man was born first from the clay and breath, followed by woman from a rib taken while Adam slept. Yet that is the version carried forward in sermons and scripture. There is another whisper, one that insists the rib was not the beginning, but a revision. The older murmur tells of a woman fashioned not from Adam, but with him. The soil was the same, the spark of divine breath the same. They rose side by side, their eyes opening to the same horizon, their bodies standing on the same ground. Equal not only in form, but in essence. Where Adam carried the dust of the earth in his veins, so too did she. Where his heart beat with the rhythm of the new world, so too did hers. She was not second, not derivative, not a part extracted from his side. She was whole, complete, and independent from the very first breath. Later generations would call her Lilith, some in awe, some in dread, some in fury. But in those earliest moments of her story, she bore no such reputation. She was simply the other half of humanity, as ancient as Adam, as entitled to the world as he was. To walk in Eden's garden at her side was to see a partnership written into creation itself. But like dew that vanishes at sunrise, the memory of this first union was soon erased. Why was she forgotten? Was it because she refused to kneel in the shadow of Adam? Was it because equality, once tasted, proved too volatile for the story of obedience that would come after? Or was it because memory itself prefers neatness? One beginning, one pair, one fall. Scholars still turn these questions in their hands, weighing fragments of texts, comparing verses that never made it into the canon. In Jewish folklore, the explanation is sharper. She would not submit, and for that, she was written out of paradise. Yet even before her exile from Eden, the air around her was already restless with older myths. In lands far older than the Hebrew scriptures, long before Genesis was sung by wandering tribes, the people of Mesopotamia spoke of spirits with her shape and shadow. They whispered of Lilitu, the stormy night demon who rode the winds and slipped through cracks in the walls. These beings, neither fully divine nor human, carried the same aura of danger that would later cling to Lilith's name. It is tempting to wonder, did Lilith borrow her form from them, or did they emerge because her presence demanded an echo across civilizations? The story pauses here, on the edge of knowing. In one hand, the rib and the tail of Eve, the woman who came second. In the other, the dust of creation that bore Lilith, the woman who came first. The two versions cannot easily be joined, yet both persist, layered like sediment in the human memory. The observer stands between them, listening to both currents at once. The question presses forward, impossible to dismiss. If Lilith was there from the beginning, what else has been forgotten or deliberately silenced in the story of how humanity began? The air of Eden still trembles with her absence. The grass bends, though no one walks there. It is as if creation remembers, even if scripture does not. And so the tale begins, not with a rib, but with a refusal to vanish, long before the garden was dreamed into words. Before rabbis argued over the order of creation, before Lilith's name was ever paired with Adam's, the winds of Mesopotamia carried a different story. In that land of baked clay and rushing rivers, where the Tigris and Euphrates curled like twin serpents through the desert, people etched their fears and hopes into tablets. The marks pressed into the soft clay hardened into permanence, surviving long after palaces crumbled and empires sank into the dust. Among those markings appears a whisper, not of Eden, but of the night. A name not yet fully formed, Lilitu. Lilitu was not the wife of Adam, nor even the daughter of any god. She was one of many spirits who moved unseen in the darkness, riding the restless air. They were called wind demons, their shapes imagined as female, their presence felt as a chill slipping through unguarded windows at night. The Sumerians feared them as bringers of sickness and nightmares. Mothers sitting by cradles told their children to sleep tight, for Lilitu might drift in on a breath of wind if the shutters were left open. Here is the first contradiction. These beings were often described as beautiful. Their faces were alluring, their hair long, their eyes bright. But the beauty was only a lure, a shimmer hiding a venomous intent. Desire and danger moved together in their presence. Men claimed that Lilitu visited them in dreams, drawing them into embraces that left them weakened, drained, or ill. Women feared her more directly, for she was thought to hover around expectant mothers, causing miscarriage or stealing infants from their first breath. Archaeologists have uncovered charms and incantations written in cuneiform meant to drive these spirits away. The words were blunt. Keep Lilitu from the bedchamber. Keep her from the threshold. Keep her from the mother in labor. The fear was strong enough to carve protection into amulets of clay, stone or metal, worn against the skin or hung above the bed. Already the figure we would later call Lilith was being shaped. Not yet a character in a sacred narrative, but an embodiment of what people dreaded most: loss, vulnerability, the fragility of life in a world where death waited at every doorway. But the question persists. Was Lilitu always evil? Or was she simply the shadow people cast when they needed someone to blame? Childbirth in the ancient world was a perilous gamble, often ending in tragedy. To lay the fault on a spirit, to name it and describe it, was a way to hold chaos at arm's length. Scholars still debate whether Lilitu was a literal belief in a demon or a poetic metaphor for the unpredictable misfortunes of life. Yet the fact remains, in Mesopotamian lore, she was real enough to fear, real enough to protect against, real enough to whisper about in the dark. As the centuries passed, the stories tangled. Lilitu began to merge with Lamashtu, another night terror in female form, who was said to drink the blood of infants and gnaw on their bones. The boundary between them blurred, as if myth itself could not decide whether they were sisters, rivals, or the same being under different names. This is how myth works: overlapping, merging, leaving questions no historian can untangle fully. The observer imagines the desert wind carrying these whispers from one village to another, from one century to the next. A family kneels by the fire, repeating a chant to ward off Lilitu. A scribe presses her name into clay. A traveler mutters of night spirits along the road. Layer upon layer, fear carves itself into culture until Lilitu is not just a rumor, but a presence. And here lies the strange symmetry. While the Hebrews would one day speak of Lilith leaving Eden, the Mesopotamians already spoke of her as one who never needed to leave. She was always on the margins, outside the walls, just beyond the firelight. The night was her dwelling, and humanity, fragile, hopeful, fearful humanity, was her prey. If Lilith begins anywhere, it is not with a rib, but with the restless wind. The clay tablets remember her. The charms carved with trembling hands remember her. The mothers who sang lullabies, half in comfort, half in fear, remembered her. And those centuries would pass, and her name would change, and her story would be braided into scripture. The image remained. A woman of the night, powerful, dangerous, and untamed. So when later traditions placed Lilith in Eden, standing equal with Adam, was it truly a new tale? Or was it an old shadow carried on the wind from Mesopotamia, reshaped to fit into the garden story? The line between history and myth grows thin here, trembling like the reed stylus over wet clay, leaving behind a mark we still struggle to read. Across the Mesopotamian plain, where ziggurats rose like steps toward heaven and priests offered incense to the unseen powers, the night belonged to figures far less benevolent. Among them was Lamashtu, a name that even now seems to carry a rasp of menace. She was no minor spirit, no fleeting gust of wind blamed for a shiver. Lamashtu was carved into the heart of fear itself. In tablets and incantations, she is described as a daughter of the gods, but twisted, an outcast who turned her strength toward torment. Her face, sometimes painted with the head of a lioness, sometimes with the grimace of a hag, was paired with a woman's body. Her hands bore claws, her feet talons of a bird. In one hand she might clutch a serpent, in another a dagger. She stalked the night, preying upon pregnant women, feasting on newborns, spreading sickness like a cloak. The people of Mesopotamia named her openly, and in naming, they feared her all the more. It was beside this figure that Lilitu, the wind spirit, the night wanderer, was often placed. The boundary between them blurred, until even scholars today wrestle with the question: were they rivals, or two faces of the same terror? In some incantations, their traits overlap. In others, they are carefully distinguished. Lamashtu was more monstrous, more openly violent. Lilitu, more seductive, more subtle in her dangers. Together, they created a tapestry of fear that wrapped itself around childbirth, illness, and death. One image, found on ancient amulets, shows a pregnant woman lying in bed while demons circle her. Protective inscriptions coil around the border, invoking gods and spirits to hold the night terrors at bay. Among them, Lilitu and Lamashtu lurk at the edge. In those days, amulets were not mere trinkets. They were survival, small anchors of hope when medicine was uncertain and life was fragile. A bronze plaque might show the god Pazuzu, hideous but protective, warding off Lamashtu with his ferocious gaze. Mothers wore his likeness around their necks or tied it to their doors. The irony is sharp. To fight one demon, you needed the image of another. The observer imagines those homes, the clay walls and reed mats, the fire dimming low. Outside, jackals call to one another across the fields. Inside, a mother grips an amulet tight, whispering prayers into the darkness. She knows that if the cries of her child fall silent too soon, her neighbors will murmur the name of Lamashtu or Lilitu. To have a figure to blame was not comfort, but it was explanation. The world was not random then. It was haunted. This blurring of Lilitu and Lamashtu shows how myth is never static. Stories cross-pollinate, absorb, and merge. A dangerous woman becomes a night demon. A night demon takes on the claws of a lioness. The two are spoken in the same breath. Over generations, the boundaries dissolve, and what remains is a figure both specific and vague, both uniquely feared and infinitely adaptable. This is how Lilith's roots deepened long before she would be written into the folklore of Eden. She was already present in the trembling of Mesopotamian mothers, already present in the bronze amulets etched with incantations, already present in the darkness that people sought to push back with words and charms. But questions linger. Did these spirits originate as supernatural beings, or as personifications of the dangers surrounding childbirth and disease? Some scholars suggest they were mythologized fears, projections of human vulnerability into the night. Others argue that the consistent descriptions across centuries hint at something more, a tradition too widespread, too stubborn to dismiss as metaphor alone. And still others wonder if the shadow of Lilith we know today was born in this fusion, the product of Lilitu and Lamashtu intertwining until one name, one legend, one mythic figure emerged. The story pauses again on this uncertainty. If Lilith is indeed heir to these demons of Mesopotamia, then she did not begin as a rebel wife or an exile from paradise. She began as the personification of danger itself, a reminder that life was fragile, that the womb could be a tomb, that the night was never empty. Her later role as Adam's equal, then, is not a contradiction, but an expansion, a merging of ancient terror with later questions of obedience and autonomy. The observer watches as these figures drift forward in time, crossing the desert, carried by traders, by stories told at night, by scribes pressing unfamiliar names into clay. Lilitu and Lamashtu linger together at the threshold of memory, shadows waiting for their transformation. In the centuries to come, the world would know them not separately, but as one enduring name. Lilith, the clay tablets of Sumer cracked and eroded, but the figures etched into them refused to vanish. As centuries passed and Babylon rose to power, Lilitu's shadows sharpened. She was no longer just a category of wind spirits, faceless and interchangeable. She was becoming singular, a name that lingered on the tongue. Lilith. By then, amulets were not merely decorated with protective signs. They bore her presence explicitly, as if her very name had power both to threaten and to guard. It is a strange paradox, one that repeats across cultures. The thing most feared is also the thing most invoked. A mother desperate to protect her child might hang a charm not just against Lilith, but marked with her name. To name her was to acknowledge her dominion, and by acknowledging, perhaps to restrain. Fear, when inscribed, becomes a form of control. By Babylonian nights, Lilith was whispered as an entity who crept through windows and hovered at cradles, who took life before it had fully begun. Yet the people who feared her also kept her close, in spells, incantations, and ritual protections. She was not just a menace. She was a known menace, a fixed point in the landscape of danger. And in that way, she became a constant companion to the living, haunting them with the intimacy of inevitability. The observer notes how her form changed here. In the oldest Sumerian texts, she was one among many night spirits. In Akkadian traditions, she blurred with Lamashtu, indistinct and chaotic. But in Babylon, she began to take shape as an individual. To carve her name into stone was to give her solidity. She was no longer merely a demon. She was Lilith, the demon. And with a name comes memory, story, identity. One artifact, known as the Burni relief, depicts a female figure with wings and bird-like talons, flanked by owls, standing upon lions. Scholars debate whether this is truly Lilith. Some argue it is a goddess, Inanna or Ishtar. But the resonance is difficult to ignore. A woman with wings and clawed feet, bound to night creatures, is an image that would follow Lilith for millennia. whether or not the relief was meant for her. It shows how the imagination of the region shaped its fears into feminine, winged, nocturnal form. Yet Babylonian Lilith was not bound to the story of Adam, nor even to Eden. She had no quarrel with men, no dispute over hierarchy. She was danger in its purest form, autonomous, untethered, not created for submission or companionship. In this sense, she embodied a different fear than later traditions would emphasize. Not the fear of rebellion within a household, but the fear of chaos intruding from outside. She was the desert wind made flesh, the cry in the night without explanation. The paradox deepens. If Lilith was feared so greatly, why was she not erased? Why did her name survive when so many others vanished with the fall of cities and the ruin of temples? Perhaps because she filled a need. She explained what could not be explained. The sudden stillness of a child, the ache of miscarriage, the helplessness of desire. To remove her would be to remove the explanation. So instead, the people of Babylon etched her deeper, ensuring her shadow would follow them even into exile. Scholars still argue over how direct the connection is between Mesopotamian Lilitu and the Lilith of later Jewish folklore. Was she carried directly from Babylon into Israelite thought during the exile? Or did similar figures arise independently? Some point to linguistic continuity, the way Lilitu drifts phonetically into Lilith. Others caution that stories mutate in ways that resist neat genealogies. What is certain is that by the time Jewish writers named her, she was already ancient, already steeped in centuries of fear. The observer lingers on this moment of crystallization, when Lilith moved from being one spirit among many to being the spirit with a name. To name is to summon, to mark, to preserve. From spirit to name, from whisper to word, from faceless night to enduring myth. Lilith had crossed a threshold, and once named, she could not easily be forgotten. The scrolls of Mesopotamia had long whispered of Lilith as a night spirit. But it was only centuries later, in the twilight of the Middle Ages, that her shadow was drawn directly into the Garden of Genesis. There, in the margins of Jewish folklore, she was no longer only the demon of winds and night terrors. She was reimagined as Adam's first companion, a woman not formed from a rib, but from the same earth that shaped him. In this telling, she was not secondary, not derivative. She was his equal. And it was precisely this equality that shattered paradise. The story comes most vividly from a strange and unsettling text known as the Alphabet of Ben Sira, written somewhere between the 8th and 10th centuries. Not a canon of scripture, not a polished theology, but a gathering of legends and satire. It dared to record a tale that mainstream tradition ignored. In its pages, Lilith and Adam rise together from the soil, bound by the same breath. Yet from the moment they meet, the balance tilts toward conflict. Adam insists upon dominance, even in the most intimate moments. Lilith refuses. Why should she be beneath him, she argues, when they were made alike? Why should dust command dust? Their dispute may seem trivial to modern ears, an argument over who would lie on top. But within it lies a deeper wound, the question of power. Adam demanded hierarchy, Lilith demanded equality. And in a world not yet corrupted by sin, the first fracture of paradise came not through disobedience to God, but through defiance between man and woman. Frustrated and unyielding, Lilith pronounced the ineffable name of God, a word humans were never meant to utter. And with that word, she claimed the power to leave. No cherub blocked her path, no flaming sword barred her. She rose into the air and vanished, not cast out, but self-exiled, choosing wilderness over submission. It is here that her story breaks sharply from Eve's. Where Eve was shaped as a companion and blamed for a fall, Lilith was shaped as equal and blamed for her refusal. The observer watches Eden in that moment of silence after her departure. Adam, alone again, complains to God of his loss, his grievance sharpened by rejection. And God, in this tale, listens. What follows is a punishment both strange and cruel. Lilith, having fled, is said to dwell by the Red Sea, where she mates with demons and bears countless offspring, monsters and spirits called Lilith. But her freedom comes with a cost decreed from heaven. 100 of her children would die every day. And so, in grief and rage, Lilith utters her vow. If her own children are doomed to perish, she will turn her eyes toward the children of men. Newborns in their cradles, mothers in their labor, infants yet unnamed, these will feel her wrath. Her exile becomes humanity's terror, her refusal to submit transformed into a curse upon generations. What is striking is how this tale reshapes Lilith. In Mesopotamia, she was simply danger, an external threat. In Eden, she becomes a rebel, a woman with agency. She does not merely drift through windows, she chooses to walk away from paradise. She does not simply haunt the vulnerable, she strikes in revenge. And because she refused to return, she was remembered not as equal, but as enemy. Scholars still debate the meaning of this shift. Was the tale a satire, mocking the disputes of men and women in medieval households? Was it a serious attempt to explain an enigmatic figure who appeared on the edges of Scripture? Or was it something darker? A story sharpened into a warning against women who refused the authority of men. The ambiguity remains, as alive as the legend itself. From this moment onward, Lilith could never again be simply a night demon. She became Adam's first wife, the forgotten half of the beginning, erased from the garden not by divine decree but by her own choice. And in that choice, she became unforgettable. The garden continued without her. Eve would be formed, the rib taken. The story we know today would unfold. But the soil of creation had already borne another figure, and the night still carried her name. When Lilith left Eden, her footsteps did not vanish into silence. They echoed into wilderness and myth, carried by winds that touched the edges of human fear. Her exile was not a conclusion, but the beginning of her most infamous form. The alphabet of Ben Sira tells that once she fled to the shores of the Red Sea, she did not remain alone. There she joined with spirits and demons, bearing countless children, offspring described in whispers as Lilith, creatures of shadow and night. Yet her freedom came at a devastating cost. For daring to leave paradise, for daring to say the secret name of God, a sentence was pronounced. 100 of her children would die every single day. Imagine the weight of that grief. 100 cries silenced daily, 100 shadows fading into dust before they had scarcely begun to live. Lilith's independence, won at such price, was marked forever by mourning. But sorrow alone was not her legacy. From her anguish arose a vow. If her children were to be taken from her, then she would take the children of others. She would stalk the cradles of newborns, hover over the beds of mothers in labor, turn her loss into vengeance. In this transformation, Lilith shifted once more. From equal partner, she became adversary. From woman, she became threat. From mother, she became killer. The tragedy of her curse was woven into fear of every household. Families whispered her name not in reverence, but in terror. believing that sudden infant death, miscarriage, or the perils of childbirth were the work of Lilith's hand. And yet, even in this fear, there is a trace of strange justice. For Lilith had been condemned not for murder, but for defiance. She refused to kneel. She refused to let her existence be defined by Adam's command. And the punishment for her independence was unimaginable loss. In that loss, she was transformed, not erased, not destroyed, but bent into the role of the eternal enemy of children. The observer lingers over the image of the Red Sea. Waves breaking against the shore, a woman of shadow pacing the sand, surrounded by countless children of the night, each one doomed by decree. Her cry mingles with the surf, a lamentation that drifts into legend. To some, she is only monster. To others, she is victim and rebel. Scholars still debate whether the myth reflects ancient attempts to explain sudden infant death, or whether it carried a sharper edge, a warning to women who might resist their expected roles. Perhaps both. The curse of children became central to her image. It was told that she especially targeted male infants before the 8th day, before the covenant of circumcision bound them to God. Female infants she haunted before the 20th day, as though marking the liminal spaces when life was most fragile. These details reveal less about demons than about human fear. Life in the ancient world was perilous. Survival of infants was never assured. To speak of Lilith was to give those tragedies a name, a face, a story. And in giving them story, people could imagine defenses. But the paradox grows deeper. In making her the thief of children, folklore also made her a mother, one who mourned the endless slaughter of her own brood. Behind the terror, there lingers a shadow of sorrow. Was Lilith monstrous because she chose to be? Or because her punishment gave her no other shape? The curse of children is not only a tale of vengeance. It is a story of grief weaponized, of independence twisted into demonhood, of a woman's refusal remembered only through the harm she was said to bring. The night carries her footsteps still, in every whispered fear beside the cradle, in every lullaby sung as much to ward off shadows as to comfort the child. Lilith's children were taken from her. In return, she became the figure mothers most feared would come for theirs. The story of Lilith's vengeance did not end with her curse. In the old tales, Adam, distraught and angered by her refusal and her vow, turned his complaint upward. He asked God for justice, for protection against the woman who had fled Eden, but whose shadow still touched his world. And in answer, 3 angels were dispatched: Senoi, Sansenoi, and Samangelof. Their names, strange and rhythmic, were etched into memory not because of the power they held in heaven, but because of the power they held in the nursery. The legend tells that these angels sought Lilith at the shores of the Red Sea, where she brooded among her demonic offspring. They demanded her return, commanded her to rejoin Adam and restore order to the garden. But Lilith, fierce in her independence, refused. She would not crawl back. She would not submit. She would not erase the choice she had made. Her refusal, however, could not erase the punishment. The decree remained. 100 of her children would die each day. And so a strange bargain was struck. Lilith swore that wherever she saw the names of these 3 angels written, she would not harm the children of that house. She could not undo her vow of vengeance, but she could honor this exception. The pact gave birth to a practice that endured for centuries. Protective amulets inscribed with angelic names hung above cradles and carved into charms. Mothers placed them near their infants. Fathers etched them into doorways. Households leaned on them as shields against the night. The observer imagines a flickering oil lamp in a small stone house. A mother hums a lullaby, but her eyes drift off into the wooden amulet hanging by the bed. Its surface bears the curling letters of Senoi, Sansanoi, Samanjalov. To the modern eye, it is a fragment of folklore, but to her, it is armor. If the baby stirs in the night, she whispers the name softly, as though the sound itself could weave a circle of protection. Outside, the wind stirs. Inside, the angels stand guard. Was Lilith truly restrained by this pact? Or was the amulet a vessel of hope in an uncertain world? Scholars debate whether such charms reflect literal belief in a demon or a psychological ritual against grief. Some see them as remnants of magical thinking, others as evidence of how deeply Lilith's legend was woven into lived experience. Yet all agree on the persistence of the practice. Amulets survive in museums today, scratched with names that mothers once trusted more than medicine. There is irony here. Lilith, who had once been equal with Adam, was now cast into the role of menace, and the only defense against her came through names of power. Other names, angelic names, written over hers. To speak her name alone was to invite fear. To speak theirs was to push her away. In this struggle of words, one truth stands out. Names themselves were the battlefield. To call upon the angels was to rewrite the story, to deny Lilith the victory of silence. The legend of the angels also softens Lilith in a curious way. Even as she is painted as a child killer, she is remembered as a figure who honors her word. She does not break the pact. Where the names appear, she withdraws. She is not chaos without limit, but a force bound by oaths. That nuance unsettles the narrative. If she were pure evil, why would she honor any agreement at all? It suggests that even within demonization, a trace of dignity remained. The observer lingers on this paradox. At the threshold of every cradle, Lilith stood as terror, but at the same threshold, angels stood as guardians. The struggle was not fought in swords or storms, but in names, in words written on wood, in whispers passed from parent to child. Lilith became more than a demon in this way. She became a presence built into the architecture of home, a shadow accounted for in the very act of protection. The nursery amulet tells us something the texts do not say directly, that Lilith, for all her vengeance, was believed to be close. Not a distant myth, not an abstract idea, but a presence felt at the door, at the bed, at the side of the infant breathing softly in the dark. And though angels were summoned against her, her story endured just as strongly as theirs. The image of Lilith changed as her legend traveled. No longer only the unseen wind or the whispering shadow. She began to take on a body, a face, and a presence that artists and storytellers could describe. Her portrait is inconsistent, never one form, never bound to a single likeness. But in nearly every version, she carries the same paradox. Beauty laced with menace, allure sharpened into fear. Her hair is often the first detail mentioned, long, flowing, unbound. Sometimes black as midnight, sometimes red as fire. To the ancient imagination, loose hair was not simply fashion. It was a sign of untamed energy, uncontrolled by braid or veil. Lilith's hair spilled like a storm, a crown of rebellion that framed her dangerous beauty. Her eyes, too, were unforgettable. Wide, luminous, sometimes glowing like an owl's in the night, sometimes described as too sharp, too knowing, as if they could pierce through the illusions of men. Artists gave her wings, great feathered spans that suggested her flight from Eden, her refusal to be contained by earth alone. From her feet they drew talons, claws instead of toes, remnants of her Mesopotamian ancestry where she stood as half-woman, half-bird of prey. To some, she was entirely human in appearance until night fell, and then the illusion dissolved, revealing her claws and wings. To others, she was always both, a hybrid presence straddling the line between woman and beast. Owls became her companions, creatures of the night whose silent flight and piercing gaze seemed to mirror her own. In carvings and reliefs, she sometimes stands between them, or with their faces hovering nearby, reinforcing her dominion over darkness. The owl, predator of the night, became her totem, her emblem, her echo. The observer imagines an ancient craftsman carving her likeness into clay. Long hair cascading over her shoulders, her body poised between beauty and danger. Wings unfurled, talons gripping the ground. Was he imagining a literal being he feared might enter his home? Or was he giving shape to the anxieties of his people? The terror of childbirth, the lure of forbidden desire, the unease of feminine power that could not be subdued. Perhaps both. Descriptions of Lilith almost always emphasize contradiction. She is beautiful, yet terrifying, alluring, yet fatal. Her form tempts, but her touch destroys. This duality made her the perfect scapegoat for human fears about sexuality and independence. Erotic dreams? Blame Lilith. Infidelity? Blame Lilith. Desire that felt dangerous, overwhelming, uncontrollable? That too could be her work. She became the embodiment of a truth society could not admit. That attraction and fear often walk hand in hand. Scholars still debate the origins of these features. Did the wings and talons descend from depictions of earlier Mesopotamian spirits? Or were they later additions shaped by medieval imagination? Was her beauty exaggerated to make her a more effective seductress? Or did it emerge naturally from the archetype of dangerous women in folklore? The uncertainty itself is part of her endurance. She does not rest in one form, but flows through many, refusing to be pinned down. The observer sees her standing at the edge of the candle's glow, her silhouette shifting with each blink of the flame. To one watcher, she is a woman of impossible beauty, hair tumbling like a river of night. To another, she is a bird of prey, wings spread, talons ready to strike. To a third, she is both at once, mesmerizing and monstrous, the very embodiment of what cannot be tamed. Her beauty is not comfort, but warning. Her talons are not hidden, but displayed. She does not disguise her danger, but wears it openly as if to say, the line between desire and destruction has never been as wide as we pretend. When the lamps were extinguished and the night settled heavy upon the house, there was always the chance that the dreams would not be one's own. In Jewish folklore, in medieval demonologies, in whispered traditions passed from one generation to another, Lilith was blamed for the restless shadows of sleep. She was not merely a figure of myth anymore. She was the explanation for why men woke in the dark, breathless, shamed, drained, with the memory of a presence that was neither entirely dream nor entirely real. Lilith slipped into beds unseen, the tales say, and pressed herself into the dreamer's mind. She did not roar or strike with claws. She moved in silence, with a beauty sharpened into a weapon. To embrace her was to feel both ecstasy and ruin. The medieval imagination gave her a new name for this role: succubus, the female demon who visited men in the night, feeding upon desire and leaving weakness in her wake. And once again, a paradox was formed. She was both the lover and the thief, both the granting of pleasure and the draining of life. To the frightened and pious, Lilith's nightly visitations explained more than mere dreams. They accounted for temptation, lust, the secret thoughts that men were told to suppress but could not. What better way to externalize forbidden longing than to say, "It was not me, it was her." The succubus became the scapegoat for the sins of the flesh, and Lilith, already infamous as a child killer, now bore the weight of sexual transgression as well. The observer imagines a monk in a stone cell, tossing in sleep, awaking in a cold sweat, whispering prayers to drive away a shadow that still lingers in the corner of the room. He blames her, this woman of the night who crept into his bed, though the door was locked and the lamp was out. He carves the sign of the cross, but in his mind, her eyes still gleam. Her name gives his weakness form. Scholars note that in demonological texts, Lilith is rarely alone. She's surrounded by hosts of succubi, her daughters or her kindred, all cast as predators of men's souls. In this tradition, Lilith is queen of a nocturnal court, presiding over spirits who ensnare humanity through desire. Yet within this portrayal lies an unease. Why was it always women who bore the blame? Why was forbidden longing personified as female intrusion, rather than as male weakness? The answer, perhaps, is not hidden in the heavens, but in the structures of human fear and control. Even so, Lilith's role as succubus was never entirely one-dimensional. Some texts suggest that men who consorted with her in dreams might be drawn into otherworldly knowledge, glimpsing truths through the haze of forbidden intimacy. Desire and revelation intertwined, as though Lilith's embrace carried not just ruin, but insight. In certain occult writings, she does not only drain, but awakens, forcing the dreamer to confront what he has denied in himself. The line between nightmare and vision grows thin here. Was Lilith a thief of vitality, or a messenger from the shadows of the psyche? Was she chaos sent to punish, or was she a mirror, showing humanity its own suppressed longings? Scholars still disagree, but the stories endure. The observer listens to the hush of a sleeping city and wonders how many dreams bear her trace even now. She does not scream. She does not shout. She leans close, a whisper, a touch, a shadow on the edge of waking. And when the dreamer gasps awake, trembling in the dark, she's already gone, leaving only the certainty that something had been there, and that it bore her name. Night falls over a different kind of map, not of rivers and cities, but of emanations. 10 lights set like lanterns upon an invisible lattice. Mystics called them sephirot, vessels for the flow of divine life, a pattern by which heaven breathed itself into the world. The observer watches those lights glow, crown, wisdom, understanding, mercy, severity, beauty, victory, splendor, foundation, and finally, a kingdom called presence, where divinity rests among mortals. This much is an observed fact of tradition. Medieval Kabbalists, and especially the compilers of the Zohar, taught of a tree of life with 10 sephirot, a living diagram of creation's pulse. Yet every lamp throws a shadow, and behind the tree of life, a second tree gathers. The husks, the shells, the refuse of imbalance. If one map charts harmony, the other records its fractures. Here, the legend of Lilith shifts from house and cradle to cosmology. She is no longer only an intruder at the window. She becomes the sovereign of a realm. The shadow tree bears a name too. The Qliphoth, the shells that cling to holiness like bark to wood or like ashes to flame. And beside a dark prince, the angel called Samael, the venom of God, stands a queen. Some circles name her outright as Lilith, and say their union is a counterfeit of sanctity. Where the Sephirot pair in pure balance, these two pair in hunger, fusion without blessing, heat without light. The The observer notes how the old domestic fear, mother, child, threshold, has been translated into a cosmic grammar. That which could once enter a bedroom now can seize a world. A second lamp of evidence flickers. In strands of Kabbalah, the Shekinah, divinity's feminine nearness, dwells among the lowliest places and longs to reunite with her source. But in the broken seasons, when the world forgets itself, Shekinah is said to be exiled, and the breach invites impostors. There, say the mystics, Lilith reigns. If the presence is the true bride, Lilith is the shadow bride. If union is meant to heal, her embrace drains. In this mirror, Adam does not appear. The drama has moved past Eden to the scaffolding under reality, and Lilith is no longer only a name, but a function. She is the gravity that pulls the unfixed lower, the seduction of power without alignment, the crown of a barren tree. Scholars still argue over how literally to read this throne. Some maintain that Zoharic passages about Lilith are symbolic warnings, coded meditations on misdirected desire and the danger of severing eros from sanctity. Others contend that demonology in these texts is as concrete as their angels, that the authors cataloged powers they deemed real, not metaphors dressed as monsters. Still others point out that the intricate mapping of Lilith to specific shells blooms most fully in later systems, Lurianic Kabbalah, and centuries after, the Western esoteric orders, suggesting that the tidy charts we inherit may be late grafts onto an older, wilder vine. The debate remains: allegory or taxonomy, disclosure or deterrent? The observer does not answer. He listens to the arguments as one listens to surf against rock, steady, unresolved. Yet the story speaks with its own confidence. It says, whenever the Sephirot stream in balance, the world is clarified. Whenever their channels clog, the shells fatten, and Lilith's court grows bold. It hints that every human act feeds one tree or the other. Charity thins the husk, cruelty swells it. Truth thins the husk, flattery swells it. Love rightly aligned returns the exile. Lust severed from covenant enthrones the queen of shadows. These are not laws of physics. They are maps of conscience, the kind that make the pulse quicken in a quiet room. A brief pause. The observer lifts his gaze from the diagram and out toward the listening crowd. If this long walk through legend and scholarship has stirred something, a question, a spark, a shiver, let the journey continue together. Let the listener return. Subscribe to the telling. Leave a trace of their own voice so that the next turning of the story finds them again. Then the lights dim back to the tree and the narrative resumes. There is a further refinement. Some mystics speak of two Liliths, an elder, vast and crowned, moving at the level of the shells, and a younger, nearer to the human world, the dreamwalker who still slips beside beds. If this is fringe, it is a fringe that remembers its roots, cosmos and cradle braided together. Others place her along the lunar borderlands, an echo that modern occultists would later call the Black Moon, not the astronomical body, but a cipher for absence and appetite. The observer notes these elaborations not as settled geographies, but as the ways a name can stretch to fit new skies. Still, the older current remains. Shekinah and Lilith as counterfigures, two answers to the ache of distance. One gathers and heals, the other claims and consumes. The pairing with Samael deepens the contrast. If the tree of life speaks of right pairings, male and female facets that bless rather than devour, then this union of venom and rebel parodies the marriage of heaven and earth. The counterfeit dazzles because it is so close to the true. It captures the form of union while emptying it of purpose. like a song in the correct key whose words are all betrayals. The observer watches how delicately the system turns. One misplaced intention, one appetite nursed into idolatry, and the shells grow fat. The queen is enthroned, and the living channels narrow to a thread. Yet the same map promises reversal. Each merciful act peers through a crack in the husk. Each confession lightens the shell until it becomes translucent, and the hidden light leaks back into the world. If Lilith reigns where imbalance hardens, then the defeat of her court is not thunder from the sky, but thousands of small straightenings. Houses reconciled, weights rebalanced, old vows kept. Here the cosmology becomes pastoral again. The same mother who once hung an amulet now lights a candle before sundown and whispers an old blessing to welcome presence into her home. The same father who traced angelic names upon the door learns to trace fairness into his dealings. The same watcher who once blamed Lilith for his dreams now learns to reharness desire to devotion, to tether fire to hearth. In each act, a lamp brightens on the tree, and in each brightening, the counterfeit court loses a little territory. And yet, the question persists, softly. Is the queen of the Qliphoth a being out there? Or the name we give to the siphoning we allow within? Perhaps the answer is neither single nor simple. Perhaps it changes with the heart that asks it. The maps remain, the stories endure, the arguments continue, and night after night, the two trees stand, the one of lights, the one of shells. Between them moves a figure with hair like storm and eyes like midnight, a crown that is either ash or iron, and a poise that is either mourning or malice. The observer cannot tell which. The world, it seems, decides anew with every choice. The desert in Isaiah's vision is not merely empty. It is populated by absence, by ruins where jackals laugh and thorns inherit palaces. The observer lingers over the cadence of that prophecy, a catalogue of creatures that belong to desolation. Hyenas calling to one another, owls nesting in toppled stones, serpents curling in thresholds no feet will cross again. And then, within the Hebrew, a word that sounds like a hush taken shape, Lilith. When the verse is rendered into other tongues, the word tilts, night creature, screech owl, night hag. The ink itself seems to waver, as if the parchment is unsure whether it is naming an animal or invoking a presence that does not wish to be named. This is an observed fact. The Hebrew text of Isaiah 34 includes a term that later readers wrestled to place. Translators, cautious or confident, chose familiar creatures to tame the strangeness. An owl, perhaps, a nocturnal sentinel that fits the mood of abandonment. Yet the older echoes do not release the word so easily. If a Lilith is simply a bird, why do the syllables carry the chill of Mesopotamian nights? Why does the name rhyme with those wind-borne spirits who slip through unlatched shutters? Why does it sound like the same figure who once refused Eden's hierarchy and vanished toward the Red Sea? Evidence flickers at the edges. Among fragments from a desert community that wrote and prayed beside caves, there are litanies against noxious beings, catalogs designed to bind the mouths of nightmares. And in some lines, a form of the same word appears. It is not a sermon, it is a ward, a practical bulwark of ink. The effect is familiar. Write the name, mark the boundary, let the sound itself hammer the night into order. Elsewhere, medieval glosses hesitate. Some annotators risk night demon, then back away and choose owl, as if the safer bird might guard the margin from scandal. Even later, poets and preachers inherit a text where one syllable can either perch on a branch or press its fingers against the window of a nursery. Scholars still argue what the prophet meant to summon. Was Isaiah simply compiling the wildlife of wastelands, painting desolation with the palette of the night? Or did his list gesture toward forces that haunt the borderlands between sleep and waking, house and howl? A third uncertainty reaches further. If the prophet did intend the figure we have followed through tablets and folk tales, did later translators smooth the way, shaving terror into taxonomy to preserve decorum? Suppression or prudence, literal or metaphor? Each choice writes its own theology. The observer listens to the verse as it was likely recited, chanted, not merely read, with consonants that catch like pebbles in the mouth. In that cadence, Lilith does not feel like a bird. It feels like the night itself leaning closer. Yet names are not proof, only doors. A careful reader can honor the caution of the owl and the rumor of the demon at once, as if the prophet's list gathered every inhabitant of abandonment, feathered, fanged, and formless, and set them to keep watch where the city's candles have gone out. There is a fringe reading, whispered rather than taught, that says the word slipperiness was not accident, but mercy. To render the name too clearly, say some, would be to invite her. Better the indirection of a bird than the summoning of a queen. Others push further and claim the hush was policy, that scribes and translators, wary of empowering old terrors, gentled the line until only feathers remained. Between these claims and the feathered prudence stands the long habit of communities that prefer a world well-ordered, one in which every creature belongs to a page in a catalog, and no syllable opens a door to the dark. Yet the imagination keeps its own records. Artists return to the verse and paint a figure with hair like a storm and eyes like coals, perched among ruined pillars while owls crowd the lintels. Preachers who once declared her absent from Scripture find themselves pausing when they reach the word. Even if they choose screech owl, their breath hesitates, as if a second meaning waits just behind the beak. In private, parents still hang names in wood above a cradle and speak a trio of syllables, Senoi, Sansanoi, Samanjalov, because translation is not the only hedge against the night. The observer remembers how language has been the battlefield all along. In Eden, a name unspoken by mortals is spoken, and a woman rises, out of the story, out of the garden, out beyond anyone's permission. In Babylon, the act of carving her name into clay both feared and framed her, turning a roaming terror into a fixed point that could be warded. In Kabbalah, titles and pairings arrange her within a map of lights and shells. Here, in the prophet's ruin song, a single word tries to hold both meanings at once and trembles with the effort. The mainstream reading remains serviceable. Wilderness has its creatures, and when empires fall, the wild returns to claim the stones. An owl fits that truth well and provides a picture the mind can hold without flinching. But the fringe persists. If the city's fall empties the streets of men, something else walks them, and her feet make no sound. Between the two, a debate that refuses a verdict. Text as zoology or text as demonology, prudence or erasure, animal or archetype. Perhaps the point is not to decide, but to notice how deliberately the verse keeps the night alive. It refuses to leave the ruins empty. It populates them. And among its population is a word that teaches us how stories survive translation by living in ambiguity. When a term can be bird and queen, talon and vowel, it becomes unkillable. An exterminated empire leaves toppled stones. A mistranslated name leaves a shadow that learns new shapes. The observer stands at the edge of that field of thorns, listening to the dry rattle of seed pods and the small, soft sounds owls make when they blink. He also hears, just outside the circle of certainty. The barely audible intake of breath a room makes when a forbidden name is almost spoken. Between bird and presence, between dictionary and door, the night waits, and the verse keeps watch. By the time the figure of Lilith had seeped into medieval imagination, her presence was oddly lopsided. In Jewish folklore, she was everywhere. Whispered in childbirth, carved into charms, catalogued in mystic diagrams. Yet, in Christianity and Islam, the silence is louder than her speech. She vanishes from canon, from creed, from official doctrine. And still, like smoke through cracks, her outline drifts back in through other doors. In Christianity, her name scarcely appears at all. The canon knows only Eve. Adam's companion is one, not two. His fall is blamed on a serpent, not on a wife who refused to submit. And yet, though Scripture excludes her, the atmosphere of Lilith lingers. In demonological texts that flowered in the Middle Ages, inquisitors' manuals, sermons on lust, whispered exorcisms, succubi are everywhere. These women of shadow who creep into beds at night, who drain the strength of dreamers, who ensnare monks in temptation, are not named Lilith in chapter and verse. But their features echo hers. Some texts eventually name her directly as the queen of succubi, the progenitor of that nocturnal brood. The Bible itself may not have admitted her, but the imagination of its interpreters kept her close at hand. The observer envisions a monastery cloister where candlelight flickers across parchment. A monk bends over his prayers, yet his mind drifts to forbidden thoughts. When dawn comes, he blames the night's visit on a shadowy woman who entered his cell. Was she named in Scripture? Number, but demonology gave her shape, and Lilith, absent in text, was present in guilt. Islamic tradition offers a similar paradox. Lilith, by name, is unknown, unspoken. Yet stories circulate of being so close to her that the resemblance is uncanny. Among them is Al-Qarna, a female jinn said to accompany a person from birth. She feeds upon weakness, inflicts sleep paralysis, twists dreams into terror. Women whisper of her as a spirit who haunts childbirth, who endangers newborns, who seduces men in sleep. The description is almost identical to Lilith's roles in Jewish and Christian lore. The name differs, the doctrine excludes her, but the function remains. Fear writes the same story under different titles. Scholars debate whether these parallels are coincidence or inheritance. Did the figure of Lilith travel quietly with exiles, merchants, mystics, seeding fragments of her legend in lands that officially rejected her? Or are such feminine night spirits a universal archetype, born independently in every culture wherever fear and desire meet? The uncertainty endures, as it so often does in the study of myth. What is certain is that the silence of official texts did not erase her. Her outline grew sharper precisely because it was absent, because she occupied the shadows where doctrine would not shine its lamp. The observer notices a pattern. When Lilith is excluded, she reappears in folklore. When her name is suppressed, her presence multiplies under other names. The silence does not diminish her, it amplifies her mystery. In Christianity, she becomes the unspoken scapegoat for lust. In Islam, she becomes a jinn whose habits mirror her own. The common thread is not her identity, but the fear she represents. The dangerous feminine, nocturnal and independent, unbound by household or covenant. Even in her absence, Lilith presses against the edges of Scripture like a watermark, faint but undeniable. Her story teaches that what is omitted from the canon is not erased from the culture. Instead, it returns in dreams, in warnings, in the stories parents tell to keep their children safe. She remains present where she is least acknowledged, as though her very power is to exist where she is forbidden. The Middle Ages, with its shadowed cathedrals and crowded marketplaces, also had another layer, one less visible, one stitched from whispers and forbidden books. Among the shelves of grimoires, handwritten manuals of conjuration and banishment. Lilith's name returns again, no longer hushed, but invoked. She appears not in scripture, not in law, but in the language of magic. Lists of spirits to be summoned, controlled, feared, or dismissed. Her titles multiply. She is called the Queen of the Succubi, the Mother of Night Spirits, the Bride of Samael. In certain manuals, she is ranked among princes of hell. In others, she is described as a wandering shade who can be bound by ritual words. Always, she is dangerous, but also always, she is useful for the magician who dares. The observer imagines a candlelit chamber, an old book opened upon a wooden table. The scribe's Latin ink curls around her name, instructing the reader to draw protective circles, to speak the words of dismissal if she appears, to bind her with the authority of greater angels. Yet the very act of writing her name, of warning against her, inscribes her more deeply into the world. Witchcraft, too, claimed her. In villages where folk healers worked with herbs and charms, Lilith became both a threat and an ally. Women accused of witchcraft were sometimes said to consort with her, to ride with her through the night air, to learn from her the arts of seduction and harm. But not all who named her feared her. Some sought her as a patroness, a spirit of rebellion who gave voice to those whom society silenced. By the Renaissance, her image began to shift yet again. In the currents of occult philosophy that blended Kabbalah, astrology, and alchemy, Lilith became more than a demon. She was recast as an archetype, a symbol of the untamed feminine. In astrological lore, she was mapped to the dark moon, an invisible point of orbit, a phantom twin of the familiar lunar sphere. Here, Lilith was less a literal figure than a cipher for desire unchained, power unacknowledged, the shadow side of the cosmos. The observer notes how her path forks. On one side, the grimoires trap her in circles of salt and Latin prayer, a menace to be restrained. On the other, witches and mystics whisper her name with reverence, invoking her as a guide through forbidden knowledge. Between those extremes lies the evidence of survival. Lilith remained relevant, not because she was tamed, but because she could not be. She could serve as devil or goddess, peril or patron, depending on the mouth that spoke her. Scholars puzzle over this adaptability. Was it that the figure of Lilith filled a necessary gap in human imagination? A feminine presence who embodied both attraction and fear, both autonomy and destruction? Or was it that once she had been named, she became too deeply embedded to erase, capable of wearing whatever mask a culture required? Either way, her legend became a mirror, reflecting not just the anxieties of men, but the longings of those who sought her. The observer stands in a twilight where two scenes overlap. In one, a priest raises a crucifix against a succubus queen, warning of her appetite for souls. In the other, a coven of women lights candles in a circle, invoking Lilith as a mother of power, calling upon her to awaken what the world had denied them. Between condemnation and invocation, she reigns. Not by throne, not by temple, but by persistence. Her name inked into forbidden books, her figure carved into the imagination of all who feared or desired the night. Centuries turned, and with them, the meanings of Lilith. What had once been whispered as terror began to flicker as inspiration. In the modern age, her name did not vanish into superstition, but was lifted into new conversations about autonomy, about voice, about the right to choose oneself over chains. Where medieval fathers warned against her as the succubus, modern thinkers began to see her as the first woman who dared to say no. The shift began quietly in literature and scholarship. Writers noticed her refusal in Eden, not her curse, not her vengeance, but her act of walking away. They asked, was that rebellion, or was it resistance? If Adam demanded submission and Lilith refused, was she not punished not for sin, but for independence? Scholars of folklore began to recast her not as a monster, but as a symbol. And from that seed, her image grew into something the ancients might never have foreseen, a banner for empowerment. By the 20th century, Lilith's story was reclaimed in feminist movements. She was no longer the night demon who strangled infants, but the woman who would not accept domination. Plays, poems, and essays celebrated her as the first rebel, the first woman erased from history because she would not bow. The observer envisions her standing not at the cradle's edge, but on a stage, invoked by women who raised their voices against silence. Her name, once carved into amulets to ward her away, was now spoken aloud as a sign of strength. One famous emblem of this reclamation was the Lilith Fair, a music festival launched in the 1990s by and for women. Its name was chosen deliberately to transform what had been vilified into what could inspire. Thousands gathered beneath that banner, reclaiming the old legend as a space of creativity and defiance. In art, novels, and modern witchcraft, Lilith appeared again and again as the archetype of feminine autonomy, the one who would not be contained, the one who bore exile rather than subjugation. And yet, even in reclamation, her paradox endures. To some, she is still dangerous, still tied to sexuality, to anger, to the refusal of tradition. Critics argue that making Lilith a heroine ignores the darker parts of her myth, the curses, the killings, the vengeance. But perhaps that very ambiguity is what keeps her relevant. She is not safe. She is not easy. She is not a tidy symbol, but a contested one, reflecting both the fear and the fascination with women who step outside the roles assigned to them. Scholars debate whether modern feminism projects too much onto her, reshaping a demon into an icon. Yet even that debate proves her vitality. Figures who are truly dead in myth inspire no argument. Lilith, by contrast, still sparks fire. She forces a choice. Will you see her as monster or as muse? Or will you hold the tension that she might be both? The observer notes the arc of her journey, from Mesopotamian wind spirit to biblical exile, from medieval succubus to Kabbalistic queen, from grimoire to festival stage. Few figures travel so far across time and culture. Fewer still manage to remain dangerous even as they are celebrated. But Lilith has done both. The modern reclamation does not erase her darkness. It reframes it. What was once condemned as chaos is reinterpreted as freedom. What was once painted as seduction is reimagined as power. Where once mothers prayed to ward her away, now daughters invoke her to find their voice. Whether as demon, goddess, or feminist icon, Lilith endures because she embodies a truth older than any doctrine, that some spirits cannot be tamed, and some names cannot be erased. The story winds now to its quietest turn. After deserts and monasteries, after grimoires and feminist banners, after centuries of fear and fascination, Lilith still stands. Neither fully demon nor fully goddess, neither holy villain nor holy heroine. She endures because she embodies a refusal, and refusal has no grave. Myths die when they become irrelevant. Lilith persists because her defiance never ceased to resonate. The observer pictures her across time, on a clay tablet as Lilitu, her name scratched by trembling hands. On a nursery amulet, her threat kept at bay by 3 angels' names. In Kabbalistic diagrams, enthroned as Queen of the Husks beside Samael. In monasteries, blamed for dreams that monks could not confess. In occult circles, invoked as the patron of forbidden knowledge. In feminist essays, rising as the first woman who chose exile over obedience. Each form contradicts the other, yet all are true. She is a composite made of fear, grief, longing, and desire. What unites them is not her face, which shifts endlessly, but her choice. She walked away. She would not submit, not even in paradise, not even when silence would have bought her safety. For that, she was cursed. For that, she was demonized. And for that, she was remembered. Her story is both caution and inspiration, depending on the ear that hears it. To the fearful, she is the succubus who steals children. To the hopeful, she is the rebel who chose herself. Scholars still debate whether she was ever meant to be a literal figure. Was she a spirit borrowed from Mesopotamian lore, or a symbol created to warn against women's independence? Was she a parody invented by medieval satirists, or a living archetype that outgrew every cage it was given? No single answer closes the question. Perhaps that is her truest form. Ambiguity itself, the space where certainty collapses and imagination takes root. The observer lets the pace slow now. The noise of arguments fades, leaving only the steady presence of a figure who has been walking beside humanity for millennia. She is seen in firelight, in candle flame, in the glow of computer screens where her story is searched anew. She is never far from the edge of vision. Not because she is waiting to strike, but because she is waiting to be remembered. For some, she offers terror. For others, a mirror. In both cases, she demands acknowledgement. She does not beg forgiveness, nor seek redemption. She does not vanish when ignored. She waits calmly, persistently, in the margin of every story about beginnings. Whether as a wind spirit, a night demon, a queen of shadows, or a feminist icon, Lilith survives because she embodies what cannot be tamed. And so the tale closes not with a verdict, but with a quiet persistence. Lilith endures as the unforgotten exile, the immortal refusal. The observer leaves her there, at the threshold of myth and memory, at the border between fear and fascination, where she has always stood. And in that lingering silhouette lies the lesson. Some stories are not meant to resolve. Some names are not meant to fade. Lilith is one of them.